Give everyone one more minute. If anybody else is joining. So we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone, and happy Wednesday. Thanks for being here with us. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website in the next couple of days here. So we all know that the pandemic has really disrupted K-12 education. And today, two of my colleagues from NCSL, Dan Thatcher and Austin Reed, are with us to discuss both overall funding trends and challenges in K-12 education and how the influx of federal funds has affected K-12 education and some of the challenges that those funds present. Dan Thatcher is a senior fellow in NCSL's education program here in Denver, and he's tracked K-12 finance policy for over 13 years. Dan is also a co-founder of NCSL's Education Finance Fellowship. Austin Reed is the Senior Legislative Director for Education Policy in NCSL's DC office, and he covers federal education policy and represents NCSL's education interests before Congress and the administration. Prior to joining NCSL, Austin worked in the US Senate and at a national education nonprofit, and he began his career as a high school teacher. We really want this to kind of be informal and interactive, so please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions anytime. And we'll also be monitoring the chat box, so please feel free to drop any questions in there. And with that, I will hand it over to Dan.
Thank you so much, Erica, and thank you for the invitation to share today. And welcome to all those who have joined. I'm going to do the ceremonious sharing of the screen right now, and just cross this will go well. Okay. If everything went well, you should see the words education finance principles at the top of your screen. So before I get into ed finance and conversations about it, I like to ground the conversation in principles of education finance. And these come from, by the way, a publication, an NCSL publication that came out in 1996, though it's still germane. The publication was titled Principles of a Sound State School Finance System. So by the way, we are doing a reboot of this publication, a rewrite of it, and it will be out next year, early next year. So look for that. Basically, not a lot has changed. These principles are called principles because they have staying power, and that's what principles should do. So quickly, stability and revenue is what we look for. And, different topic, different day, we can talk about what that means. Sufficient resources, fairness for taxpayers, transparency and flexibility. These are some of the, these are the terms that we're working with and rewriting for the new publication. But what we're going to be looking at mostly in the context of this will be the stability and the fairness and the flexibility of the resources in the finance system as we've gone through these major upheavals and disruptions over the last 18 plus months. And for this presentation, I went back from last year when we gave a similar presentation to see what was said then, what I said then, to see what, if any of it held true, what has changed, what didn't happen, etc. So this is actually a slide from last year, and when we look back at the Great Recession to see if there was anything that we could garner from the Great Recession that may hold true for this current upheaval in state finances. And one of just to reiterate, the research that we have from the Great Recession in public education and finance is that the Great Recession did have an unprecedented impact. It treated different districts and students desperately. And the property tax was the stabilizing force throughout the Great Recession. That's even though property values declined, the property tax rates increased to offset declines and cuts in state aid. And there was, as I mentioned, a disparate impact on districts and students, and this is what research found across the nation, that it was the more high poverty districts that experienced the bulk of those cuts, or that did not have the financial wherewithal to mitigate those cuts through property tax rate increases on their own. We also found that different sets of populations of students were impacted differently on student assessments. So looking back, the hope was to mitigate those impacts moving forward. Some research from WestEd put this together and suggested some ideas that states can do to move forward to not recreate the disparate impacts that the Great Recession had on districts and students. And the differential student needs is something that actually states have been working on, from my experience working in individual states, that this was an effort long before the pandemic began, primarily looking at the weights and the identification that funding formulas used to find students who are living from poverty, and using the funding formula to direct more resources to students with concentrations of students of poverty. But then also the funding formula can also consider districts' own ability to mitigate those any declines in revenue, or cut the state aid differently to different districts based upon local wealth. So those are a couple of things that we looked at. Now we're moving forward, and the data is scant. And at the end of this, I do want to pose a question to you, because we're still gathering and culling data. It's not clear exactly what has happened so far, but this is a little insight into it. This is U.S. Census Bureau's quarterly summary of state and local government tax data that I put together on. These are quarterly changes, quarter over quarter, and we know that the Great Recession was an upheaval. But what's interesting is this far right of the graph below, the really unprecedented changes in revenue at the state level, along with, as we'll see in a moment, the unprecedented changes in student enrollment, teacher employment, all of this put together to create a very chaotic time. Again, still not entirely clear how things are shaking out. But the other thing that is interesting, this is revenue, information from the National Center for Education Statistics that requires states to send finance data every year. 2018 is the last data that we have from NCES. And this is looking at the difference in revenue, peak revenue, as reported to NCES from peak revenue, which was 2008. And what I want to draw your attention to right here is on the far left of the bottom graph. When we get to 2009, where revenue declined for the state. This is just the state revenue portion now, which would be that light green bar up top, negative 2.4%. And then hitting on 2010, it's down at negative 7.4%. Keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to that. This is a look at local education employment across the country. We saw after the Great Recession what was then an unprecedented decline in the number of teachers in the system, after it had gone up sharply since the 1970s and throughout the 80s and 90s. And we were on our way to recover the same amount of teachers in the system when the pandemic hit. And again, these graphs really highlight I really am lost for words. I'm not even trying to pretend to come up with adjectives anymore for this, but it's clear. But what has happened too is, and you may have heard this in your own communities, in your own states, even in your own schools, the lack of available teachers, and particularly substitutes, bus drivers, food service workers, all of these other tangential employees that work in the system, how hard it is for districts to find individuals to work in these positions in the school system right now. So there was a report that came out just recently within the last month, that one culprit, as the researcher goes or proposes, is that many districts that are using their federal aid to offer teachers hiring bonuses or to increase their first year salary, and this has created to put in the words of the researcher that's quoted, and she's right down here, a picture of her, Marguerite Rosa, a hiring bonanza in some districts. And so there's a lot of movement of educators across different districts right now. A lot of it supposedly is because of some of the finance or the hiring incentives that are going into place. So that's a little bit of what we know. I put this picture of Marguerite Rosa, Dr. Rosa. She's at Georgetown University and runs the genomics lab there. A lot of good education finance data is available on their website, by the way. So a few of the suggestions that she has, and by the way, these suggestions come from work that she and her colleagues do at the genomics lab, where they go through district budgets all over the country and dig in, see how districts are actually using the money, mostly the federal stimulus money, but just their budgets generally. And these are some of the cautions that they pose. And I'll just go ahead and repeat them. Spending in a way that creates a disruptive funding cliff, offsetting lost funds due to permanent enrollment declines, which I'm going to get to next, issuing problematic contracts, deploying funds inequitably across schools, failing to make sure community sees values and investments, investing without demonstrating real results for students. And one of the things that Marguerite does like to when she speaks to legislators and legislative staff, when she has done that in the past, is to reiterate communicating these spending decisions, and the value of actually doing that. That if you tell your constituents that yes, we have to make cuts, but these are the trade-offs, and this is why we're doing it. They go over a lot better than not. So one of the other big disruptions that we did see coming down the pike was big changes in students enrolling in the K-12 system. Over 20 years, between 2000 and 2020, there was a 2.9% increase in students on average from year to year entering the K-12 system. And then this time a year ago, we were estimating that we would get somewhere between 2 to 4% declines in enrollment, which again is unprecedented, whatever adjective you want to use. And sure enough, in data that was just released this month by the US Census Bureau, we did see a 3% on average decrease across the country. And this map here shows what those decreases in student enrollment were by state. Again, the national average was around 3%. This has huge implications for funding formulas, for the way that money is distributed throughout states, based upon the many states will give different amounts based on grade, will give different amounts based on or adjustments based upon sharp increases in enrollment or sharp decreases in enrollment. And I'm guessing, and this is where I would also like to hear from you, that many states have had to make adjustments, temporary shifts to account for these large shifts in enrollment. Again, actually, I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but these declines are mostly at the early grade levels: kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And you've probably heard before that we have second graders in some states that have actually never been set foot in a school yet. And it's an interesting time. So to wrap up kind of this chaotic mess of of all this data, which is accurate for where we are right now. we're looking at state appropriations to K through 12, and in comparing that to the Great Recession, looking at 2.7% around the country declines from 2008, and then from fiscal year 2009 to 2010, drop into negative 6.8% decline over the, from 2009 fiscal year. And then what's interesting though is what we're seeing now, as far as we could tell in education, a 1% decline in fiscal year 2020, 2.6% in fiscal year 2021. This is just what I found quickly. I'd like to defer to Erica too, if she has any insight on these figures. But I think this is ballpark figures, but it does begin to tell a story that in the face of unprecedented fluctuations and fluctuations in state revenue, that the K-12 education as a category of state spending has remained fairly protected. The other data I looked at is from the same time in the Great Recession, where we're looking at across the board cuts versus targeted cuts. And in the same time of 2009, 2010 fiscal years, there were more than 2/3 of the states made across the board cuts, and that impacted K-12 education. And this time, there's something like 1/5 of states that made across the board cuts, and K-12 education was held harmless in a lot of these cuts in states. So my question is, why is that? What were the conversations or the thinking, or what? I'm just from my own perspective and work, somewhat pleasantly surprised to see that even in the face of the cacophony of state revenues that was going on, that K through 12 was able to remain relatively in the grand picture of things, less scathed than some of the other programmatic areas. And that's the question I pose to you. Really, it's how was K through 12 treated in your state budgets, and what were those discussions like? What were the priorities? And then to whether you have or how you dealt with the fluctuations in your enrollment figures in your state, and what did those changes look like? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Austin. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And I will also engage in the ceremonious sharing of the screen. I appreciated that turn of phrase, Dan. Erica, it looks like I'm not able to share my screen, or it's been disabled.
Sorry about that, Austin.
No worries. It's all part of the ceremony.
There you go. Now you should be able to.
There we go. All right, let's see. Actually, screen one should just. All right, hopefully you can see a screen. All right, so Dan talked a lot about state finance policy and with a little bit of a touch on some of the news on federal education relief aid. But I want to give kind of a complete update to the extent that we have it at this point on federal education relief aid, which has come down over the last really 2 years. And kind of 3 aspects that I want to focus on here to give you updates on are, first, we'll talk about the fiscal provisions in the stimulus packages, the maintenance of effort, the maintenance of equity. I would guess that's probably top of mind for you all. We'll talk a little bit about how states are spending their ESSER dollars, their elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund dollars. And we'll talk about the local spending, which is actually where the bulk of the activity on the federal stimulus funds are taking place. So let's talk about fiscal provisions. Just a quick recap. I'm sure you're all familiar. There's a historic amount of federal funds in education right now. In K-12 alone, since March of 2020, not including regular appropriations, Congress has added in $190 billion to K-12 education, also like $4 billion to governors, and about $76 billion over into the higher ed institutions across the nation. So a tremendous amount of money, and all of these are sort of one-time funds, temporary funds, but we are in the middle of a funding window, and so how those funds are getting spent is obviously top of mind for a lot of people. Of course, these funds did not come without strings attached. For the most part, if you're a school or a state agency, there are no strings attached. But if you are a state budget office, a legislature, there are strings attached, and that's in the form of maintenance of effort. So if any state, all states accepted their ESSER funds or their GEAR funds, they were subject to maintenance of effort agreements. There are technically over a 4-year period ranging from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 23, there are 12 different maintenance of efforts provisions for states to be mindful of. As I'm sure you're all familiar, in the CARES Act, there was a sort of aggregate maintenance of effort for K-12 and higher ed. So states were required to continue to spend at least as much as they had prior to the pandemic over a 3-year average of fiscal year 17 to 19 on both K-12 and higher education. But with the subsequent 2 stimulus packages, including the American Rescue Plan, there was a modification in that it was no longer that states needed to maintain the same aggregate levels of funding, but they needed to maintain the same proportional levels of funding relative to the budget, which is, to my knowledge, new in the world of federal maintenance of effort requirements, at least through stimulus packages. We'll kind of talk about the ongoing issues that may pose to states. But there's also other new provisions that are in the related to maintenance of effort, and that's these provisions called maintenance of equity, which I'm sure you're familiar with. They're having, I think, generally more impacts in local school finance than they are in state, but they're certainly having state finance impacts as well. Essentially, for the maintenance of equity provisions, they applied to fiscal year 22 and for fiscal year 23, and they're essentially designed to prevent states from cutting funding to lower income districts. So the 2 prongs of the state maintenance of equity provision were that states could not cut funding to the bottom 20% of lowest income districts below fiscal year 19 levels. As far as I know, there really hasn't been, that's not really been an issue with states, but the one that's been a little more difficult, actually, I take that back, it has been an issue in a few areas. And the other part of the maintenance of equity prong at the state level was that states could not cut funds disproportionately to the bottom 50% of lowest income districts compared to the top 50% of districts in terms of income for the families that they serve. There's also local maintenance of equity provisions, which are fortunately, for reasons we'll get into here in a second, not as much of a direct issue that districts are having to comply with this year, but could be more of an issue down the road. Essentially, it prevented districts from making cuts to staffing or per pupil spending at high poverty schools compared to low poverty schools. So there's quite a bit of conditions attached to this historic amount of funding. And we are just seeing the fruits of that funding, as well as I think the initial complications with actually implementing these maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity provisions in states. So let's talk about the things that are really important, and that's the guidance that the Department of Education has offered for these provisions, as well as what we know about the waiver process with the Department of Education should a state need a waiver. So let's first talk about the maintenance of effort. First, as I kind of mentioned before, I think the big issue with maintenance of effort is this proportionality problem. I think originally when Congress proposed this proportional maintenance of effort, the thinking was, well, that's actually helpful for states that are seeing revenue declines. It basically says, oh, you have to spend the same proportion of your budget on K-12 and education. So that serves as a guide for making cuts. And I think that was the thinking. But then as the second stimulus bill was passed and as the third was being written, we started to get initial returns on state budget revenue, and it was actually looking pretty good. And in fact, for many states, they actually saw an increase in revenue for fiscal year 22, which then makes the proportional maintenance of effort more tricky, because now it's requiring states to potentially have to increase their spending on education compared to fiscal year 21. And of course, there are numerous other needs that states may be facing right now. So it presents a situation where states actually could be doing well by education, but maybe they did not increase either K-12 or higher ed at that level required by the maintenance of effort. Fortunately, there is an opportunity for states to seek waivers for many of these provisions, for at least the maintenance of effort provisions. And the department, in its guidance that they've released, does acknowledge that it's possible that a state maintained or increased but isn't meeting the maintenance of effort requirement. And so they've released some potential criteria through which they consider waivers. It's not specific, but essentially the big theme is that they are interested in looking at the trajectory of state investment in both K-12 and higher education over prior to the pandemic and post-pandemic. So that's something that they've at least laid out. We have seen the Department of Education sort of use this maintenance of effort requirement as sort of a subtle enforcement mechanism. We've seen the Department of Education send letters to states on a number of different topics concerning the ESSER program. Some of the letters they've sent to states have sort of been informational in nature. They've simply said, you as a state are contemplating this action with the ESSER fund, and that's not allowed by the law. Here's the statute that we're referring to. But there's been a number of letters that have been sent to states around their state action around the ESSER fund that it appears that the state isn't taking any action that is not allowed under the program, but their actions do not seem to be aligned with the Department of Education's priorities. And the Department of Education has said, we are disappointed with these particular set of actions that you're taking. We want to remind you that there are, there's a maintenance of effort waiver process, and that there's a possibility that the actions that you're contemplating may cause your waiver application to be not judged in good faith on our account. And so, while we haven't seen any actual determinations from the Department of Education on waivers for maintenance of effort, we have seen them sort of use the provision as a way to enact change. I don't think that any of the letters have been successful in changing state policy, but it has been a dynamic that we've observed since about June, and letters have kind of come out, I think, over the summer. I don't think we've seen it in the last month and a half, but they have been an interesting part of this maintenance of effort narrative. There is, and when I'm sure Erica will send around the link or this PowerPoint, and this PowerPoint has a bunch of different links that I think you'll find really useful that'll link you to a lot of places where you can dig into this stuff deeper. But here we have a link to the Department of Education's waiver portal. In fact, actually, for a few months, there were about 2 or 3 waiver requests for maintenance of effort, but actually they've added a few more, some of which are even for fiscal year 22. So the ones that have been submitted for 7 states and territories range from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 22. Some of them are more detailed than others. It's something that I actually just discovered yesterday, so I'm going to dig into a little more. But essentially, for the waiver timeline, the Department of Education is welcoming waiver applications on any of the provisions across these 3 stimulus packages when states feel that they're ready. And so we have seen some states start to submit fiscal year 22 waivers. I think the ones that have been submitted have been more in higher ed. And again, fiscal year 20 and 21, that's the aggregate maintenance of effort, but fiscal year 22 and 23 is the proportional maintenance of effort. And given the amount of revenue increases that we've seen across states, my expectation is that we would see a fairly substantial amount of waiver requests from states on those fiscal year 22 and potentially 23 maintenance of effort provisions. There is no timeline for the department to act on these waiver requests. In fact, we haven't seen any action from them since this waiver request portal was first put out in, I believe, April or May. Some have been pending since that time. And I think the indications that I've received from talking to their staff is that that's probably not a priority. But I assume, I think next fall is probably when we'll see the department start to act on those. I think the sense that I get from them is that they're not really interested in working on waiver applications until at least 90 days past the conclusion of the fiscal year. So I think for fiscal year 22, I think next fall is when fiscal year 22 we'll see a lot of those waiver applications, but I think next fall is when we see a little bit more activity from the department. But of course, that's always subject to change. I just think at this point they are not prioritizing these applications, and at this point there's not a high volume of applications. That being said, if we see a higher volume, especially in the next couple of months, that might be something that we press the department on. Over on the maintenance of equity, that's where we've seen actually a lot more activity from the department over the last few months. Essentially, there's been a number of issues that states have raised in terms of their compliance with the maintenance of equity state provisions. The Department of Education has also been asking for a significant amount of data from states pertaining to these provisions that states actually really don't collect currently. And so there's been some administrative issues with just collecting the data, but there's also been some compliance issues. Essentially, there's been the two types of issues that I've been made aware of with the maintenance of equity at least the state level, is that there's some states that have smaller school districts that have if one student leaves, that really changes their funding calculations, the state funding formula, and the way that those enrollment counts are changing is that even though the state is not technically funding the school less because of the enrollment changes, it's basically causing them to be out of compliance with the maintenance of equity provision. So that's one issue that we've seen. We've also seen at least one state that I'm aware of that had enacted some school finance reform before the pandemic. But what that resulted in is that over a number of fiscal years, they were taking money from underfunded districts and moving it to what they consider, or taking money from overfunded districts and moving it to districts that they consider to be underfunded. But that was causing them to disproportionately cut funding across that 50% threshold that's in one of the prongs of the maintenance of equity provision. So they were potentially violating the maintenance of equity that way. So those are kind of the two big issues that we've heard about from states. The department in response has kind of offered evolving guidance on this particular issue. They first issued guidance on June 9th, but then in August, they re-updated this guidance. And this is kind of significant in two ways. From the state level, they offered states more flexibility in terms of how they calculated their compliance with maintenance of equity. And I think that solved some of the issues that we had been hearing about. The bigger thing from that guidance was on the local maintenance of equity. Essentially, they granted broad exemptions. I think I have exceptions, broad exemptions for pretty much every school district. Essentially, districts had already budgeted for this school year, and school districts typically don't budget, don't take into account like per pupil staffing number counts and numbers. And so because of all the different enrollment changes and funding fluctuations that have happened over the last couple of years, there was a chance, I think, by a lot of calculations, that almost all school districts would be out of compliance with the local maintenance of equity. So that was raised to the department, and essentially they said, we're granting an exemption to all local agencies so long as they haven't cut funding or they're not implementing a funding cut within their district. They don't have to maintain equity as it's defined under the law for fiscal year 22. Remains to be seen whether that will be enforced in fiscal year 23. I think it's the department's intention to do that, but it is a pretty complicated policy and asks districts to make decisions on data that they don't necessarily collect. So something to pay attention to, but it at least has been made a non-issue for at least the next few months. Then finally, on October 1st, the department issued yet again more guidance on the maintenance of equity provision from the state level. Essentially, what they did is they noted that there are some states that have more rural schools that tend to be very small. And again, like I mentioned earlier, that a minor change in enrollment can have a major impact on the kind of funding that district gets. And essentially, the department said, within I believe it's like within a reasonable determination, the state can determine whether they've complied with maintenance of equity, and they just have to present their justification for the department. So essentially what we've seen is the Department of Education has slowly been offering additional flexibilities to this original maintenance of equity framework, because I think it's been found that this framework is not particularly suited to every single state and every state's sort of unique system for education finance. If this has been a major issue in your state, and I suspect there's a few of you where this has been, the Department of Education does have a request for information that they've put out about a couple of weeks ago, and comments are due on November 4th, but they essentially have 5 or 6 different questions about the workability of the maintenance of equity provision, and are sort of asking technical questions to understand how certain state mechanisms for school finance fits within that framework, and if there are any ways that they can update that. Essentially, that's what they've been hearing for the past few months from us and other groups, is that the sort of framework of the maintenance of equity does not necessarily work with the reality of school finance. So there's been a lot of activity on the maintenance of equity front, some activity on the maintenance of effort. We can expect a lot more activity on the maintenance of effort, I think, over the next year, 2 years, and I think the same could be said of the maintenance of equity. So these conditions have I think been were fairly significant. I think in Congress's eyes reflect the significance of the funding that's out there. but that has posed challenges to states. And it's something that the NCSL Education Committee is contemplating further policy on next week at our summit. So that's the kind of the fiscal provisions. Provide some brief updates on state spending, and then we'll go into local spending. So we'll mostly focus on the ESSER program, since that's where the bulk of funding to states is flowing through. Some things you might want to just be updated on. First, there's the Department of Education has required states to submit plans to receive the remaining 1/3 of their ESSER 3 funds. Essentially, they released about 2/3 of the funding shortly after the American Rescue Plan was passed, and then they issued a state planning process about a month later that said, we'll give you the remaining 1/3 if you submit a plan based on this document that we put out. As far as we know, there's been 44 plans that have been approved, and that all states have submitted their plans. I don't think any states have been disapproved or received significant edits. I think it's fairly simple process. And there's a link here that you can go to the department's website and see your state's plan and whether or not it's been approved. Just to recall, at least the state level, for the ESSER 3 fund, the state had to set aside at least 5% for statewide activities on learning loss, 1% for activities on after-school programs, 1% on summer school programs, and the state could also set aside about 2.5% of its funds for discretionary uses. We just finally completed a brief analysis of the state plans that have been submitted. And in fact, I guess all have been submitted, so they're all publicly available. We've looked through the approved plans. We'll draw your attention to our ESSER state plan tracker. That's a little different than the Department of Education's. The Department of Education's tracker is just for the 3rd round of ESSER funds, but our tracker actually tracks the state set aside across all 3 rounds of ESSER funding. So it's something we've been keeping up since basically the beginning of the pandemic, and actually it's due for an update soon. But I hope that resource is really helpful to you all in terms of getting a sense of how your state is allocating their statewide resources through the ESSER program. But like I said, we've done a kind of a quick analysis of some high-level themes that we've seen across state plans. Some highlights for you is that there are a number of states that have said that they will use that discretionary set aside and at least put out plans in their ARPA state plan. One thing that we've kind of noticed with these applications is that they tend to kind of function as narratives, but they're not very good budget documents. So the state might say, well, we have plans for the set aside, and maybe they'll give some level of detail, but other states will say, we're reserving this set aside and we'll use it for later, but we haven't actually decided what we're going to use it on. I think these plans are sort of in between, somewhere where they have some ideas of what they want to do, but they also recognize they have a pretty long funding window. So I think states are being cautious with putting out really specific plans for these funds, especially because the pandemic is still ongoing. But some other themes we noted: at least 27 states plan to fund technical assistance and data tools. As we'll kind of get into here in a second, tracking these funds is going to be an enormous challenge for state resources and data systems. And so I think that's recognized in some of the state plans. Seen a lot of interest across states in providing tutoring programs for students, statewide tutoring programs in particular. Seen about 13 states say that they're going to fund some level of career and technical education programs. And some other states are going to put together some early warning systems. So I think there's a real focus on making sure that the funds are being tracked well, and that also that states are paying attention to particularly vulnerable students and trying to get better data on student achievement, but also other aspects of students that can kind of help the state craft more targeted plans to respond to student academic and social needs. One thing we saw last spring, and I'll quickly address it, is we did see state legislatures pass legislation on the ESSER fund, particularly that state set aside. We put together a blog in late June around the conclusion of legislative season that kind of recapped the highlights that we saw from legislatures. Essentially, we saw many legislatures actually appropriate specifically the state set aside. So we saw a few states, New York and Wisconsin, come to mind. They just took that set aside and just distributed it straight to local school agencies through a formula. Then sometimes they would use that formula to make up some gaps in the way that ESSER funds were sent out to districts. Again, the ESSER money flows via the Title I formula. And so there are some school districts that didn't receive as much funding, and so states would appropriate their set aside to sort of make up for those funding gaps. We also saw a number of states that specifically invested those set aside funds in learning recovery initiatives. I think North Carolina and Michigan come to mind on states that really had specific programs that they were trying to fund. And some other states funded improvements to their assessment systems, I think in recognition that they really wanted to get a sense of where student learning was at coming into this fall. Another strategy we saw is that from the state perspective, technically, most of this money, the ESSER fund, 90% of it is for local spending decisions. And according to federal guidance, states cannot prohibit districts from spending their money in any specific way. But we did see legislatures pass some legislation that kind of serves as guidance for those local use of funds. I think Tennessee was an example where they sort of laid out what a good summer school program would look like and sort of offered the opportunity for districts to use their ESSER funds to fund such programs, but again, weren't requiring it. So, I wonder if we might see potentially more legislation along these lines here in the next legislative session. This idea of, well, you can't tell local districts how to spend this historic amount of federal funds, but you could provide them some good ideas. And we know that some state agencies are doing that. Obviously, the federal government provides guidance, but the legislature itself could also, enact legislation that could serve as guidance as well. And that's a good transition into the final part of this presentation, which is just the local use of funds. And again, that's where the real action's at. 90% of this $190 billion into K-12 education is actually up to the discretion of local school districts. So let's talk about just some timelines and some administrative stuff before we get into kind of what we know about how these funds are getting spent. So I think with the first couple rounds of ESSER funds, there was no requirement that school districts submitted plans to the state, but with the ESSER 3 funds, and again, that's where the bulk of this money is coming from, local school districts do have to submit plans to their state agency that describe how they're going to spend those funds. That really varies by state to state, and the timeline for school districts to submit that is I think on a national perspective, a little bit unclear, but is a requirement. So, that may be something that we'd want to look into a little more. It's just, what does this district application process look like within the state, each state? But, in terms of the funding window here, school districts have until September 30th of 2024 to spend their ESSER 3 funds. Actually, that's to obligate their ESSER 3 funds. They technically have until early 2025 to spend them. So they simply need to have entered into a contract for these funds, to use these funds or disperse these funds by the end of September in 2024. And then those funds need to be spent and liquidated by 2025. So there is a fairly substantial funding window for these funds. And there's pretty broad flexibility in the distribution of those funds. Again, these funds flow to school districts based on the Title I program, but they don't flow to schools based on the Title I program. It's actually up to the district to decide how to distribute these funds across schools or students within the district. So I think that's something that's always important to keep in mind. And then, of course, how these funds are used is also completely up to the school district. And there are very few things that I think these funds cannot be used for. There's a long list of ways these funds could be used, but as far as we can tell, there are very few things that districts cannot justify spending these funds on. And something that's come up, we've got some questions about this from state fiscal offices, is this idea of like, how does the money actually flow to the districts? And for most states, due to cash management issues, usually the school district will ask the state agency to reimburse them for the expense that they've made through their ESSER fund. So, these funds are not just being sent to districts and then just kind of sitting around in an account of, and so, I think that's a question we've gotten a couple of times. And I think that's generally for most states, the sort of administrative procedure for that. So again, districts aren't sitting on, billions and billions of dollars as they're being kind of housed at the state agency, and then they're being reimbursed as they go. So let's talk about kind of current issues with the spending of these funds. Like I said, there's never been more federal money in education, and these funds are really flexible. But I think that there are these funds maybe in practice aren't as useful or as flexible as it might seem at the outset. And that's simply because these are one-time funds. And so there's this concern of the fiscal cliff that, these funds will run out at some point. And there are a number of things that I think school districts would like to spend these funds on, but if they can't sustain the funding behind any of the programs or initiatives that they put together, that could cause them problems down the road. I mean, it could be simple as you want to hire more teachers, you become dependent on those staff, but then the funding runs out in 2024 and you might have to reduce staff. So, I think districts are more limited in their options because of this sort of fiscal cliff concerns. And so I think there's been a pretty robust conversation, but there probably needs to continue to be one around, what are really good investments that school districts can make that are for kind of one-time use of funds. So I think that's, a conversation that we're going to continue to have, and one that I think is really important. In terms of tracking these funds, I think there's some major challenges there. To be frank, we really don't have a good sense of how these funds are being spent, both in a sort of an accounting transparency way, but also just even anecdotally, it's very hard to get a sense of, nationally how these funds in aggregate are being spent. There's also a lot of misconceptions about even the spend rate. So the Department of Education and the Treasury do have some tracking mechanisms, but they can only track the funds that have actually been spent. And so there may be a number of funds that have been obligated. In other words, the district is entered into contracts to spend these funds, and they may even be receiving services from these contracts, but the funds are technically unspent. And so there's been concerns and media reports that only a small percentage of these funds have actually been spent, to suggest that maybe school districts aren't doing anything with them or they're actually not needed. But I think the reality is probably different than that, simply because of how the government is able to track and account for these funds. But again, like I mentioned earlier, I think the big sense is that actually tracking how local school districts are spending these funds is really going to come down to how well each state is able to set up a tracking infrastructure and a sort of transparency and reporting mechanisms. And certainly they can use their statewide funds to promote that and to build up those systems. But it is a pretty significant ask to put up these data systems when there are so many other challenges that are directly facing school districts and state agencies. So we've begun to see a fair amount of media reports on how these funds are being spent. I know that's something that we hear about from reporters a fair amount, and I think we'll continue to hear that. And to be frank, actually, I think a lot of media outlets have done a pretty good job of giving even policymakers a sense of how these funds are being spent. I've linked to a few of the more popular or controversial reports that have come out over the last few weeks. If you're looking at just kind of tracking how these funds are being spent, obviously our resources are very good, but there's a couple other resources at an institute called Future Ed or the Hunt Institute or even the After School Alliance that I think are doing really good work in tracking how states and districts are using these funds. And I've linked to the Treasury Department's tracking site, which is pandemicoversight.gov, which has some tools to give you a sense of how local school districts are spending these funds. But again, I think that even that tool is not giving you a complete picture of where things are at. Even spending and deciding how to spend these funds have really run into a number of issues. I think one, schools are dealing with a lot of immediate operational concerns. It's, I think, preventing them from thinking about how to use these funds. I think there's a lot of concerns about just making sure that the cafeteria has food and staff and that there's bus drivers. And it seems like a lot of school staff are still dealing with a lot of issues with just running a school in the pandemic when the virus is still spreading. So I think some of that's kind of prevented and distracted district leaders from really thinking about how to use these funds for recovery. And of course, even when they have contemplated certain strategies, there's been supply chain issues. So if the school district is interested in buying devices or hardware for student learning, there's been supply chain issues and shortages there. I think the big one is that, a lot of the big conversation last winter and early spring was about offering accelerated learning opportunities and really intensive tutoring and after school programs and bringing in mental health professionals. And there's simply not as many tutors and mental health professionals out there to meet the demand as we'd hope. And so I think there's a lot of plans to enact that, but districts are having trouble finding that labor, and in fact are often competing against health institutions to provide that for students as well. So I think there's a lot of hope about how these funds will be spent, but it's kind of meeting the reality of labor shortages and supply chain issues, and that are really impacting the rest of our country as well. An interesting survey that I think is probably the most helpful in trying to figure out how school districts on a whole are spending these funds was put out by the Superintendents Association. They did a survey. It came out in September. That was from superintendents over the summer. And you can see here some numbers on the percentages of school districts that they surveyed that are using their funds for various purposes. Of course, this survey was taken over summer. There's a lot of focus on summer and after school programs. But I'll note that at least 50% of districts say they're going to use their funds for construction. That might be, a small percentage, but there are some school districts that are considering using a fair amount of their funds for construction activities. But again, even that's running into some labor shortage issues, or there's construction companies that are hesitant to enter into contracts with districts because they don't know if they'll be able to complete the work by the time the funding has to be spent in 2025. So there's been a little bit of an issue with that. And at least in the construction side of things, I think the general indication from this survey is that urban and rural school districts were much more interested in using their funds for construction than suburban districts. You'll see here there's been a little bit less of a focus on tutoring, at least at the district level. And again, about half districts have been looking into social emotional learning responses or trauma responses. So again, these are very flexible funds. There's a lot of funds. And I think there's a whole host of concerns that schools are trying to use to address these. And even now, as we kind of head into November, I still don't think we have a very good sense of exactly how much of these funds have been used for these purposes. And so, it's something that we're going to continue to talk about for at least the next couple of years. And one that I still don't think we have a totally clear picture on. So that's a pretty deep dive into everything that's going on with these federal education relief dollars. Again, some pretty big picture fiscal issues for states in terms of complying with these provisions, and a lot of challenges with spending these funds and spending them wisely. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, or refer back to Dan's very good questions with our remaining time.
Thank you very much, Austin and Dan. I think we'll start. If anybody has any questions for them, please feel free to unmute yourself or drop a question in the chat box, and then we'll see if anybody wants to have a conversation around Dan's earlier questions. Questions for Dan or Austin? Dan, I have kind of a logistics question for you. It looked like some of your slides were Power BI graphics. Is there somewhere where folks want to drill down into that information that they can go?
Yes, the PowerPoint presentation has links on it, and bit.ly links to the little small links you can go in. Some data have state-specific data, others are just national aggregate figures, but yeah, those are built as tools for all of you.
Thank you. I will be sure to get those slides posted on the website. Other questions for Austin or Dan?
I have one observation, I suppose, that I'll just add, and that is, I have been surprised to hear that revenue has been performing better in many states. The general fund revenue, sales tax revenue, large part thanks to Wayfair and remote sales tax. High income earners are generating more personal income tax, and then corporate income tax is also shows strong returns. But this is a much news that's much welcomed. I don't know to what extent the revenue improvements counter the losses that were forecasted and budgets that were made upon those forecasts. Whether those increases or augmentations over the projections and forecasts offset all the declines that were originally built into the budgets, or in other words, are they as strong as pre-pandemic revenue, or is there still some compared to maybe the fiscal year 2019 budgets? Is it still a decline from those levels? I'm curious if anyone has the answer to that question, just kind of generally.
Carolyn says in California, the actual revenues have exceeded pre-pandemic revenues. And Dan, kind of broadly, that is what we're hearing. I think it kind of depends. There are some states that aren't quite back to where they expected to be, but there are others that are exceeding kind of their initial estimates. So generally good news.
Yes, thank you. That's great. That's, yeah, very good news.
Would anyone else like to weigh in or perhaps answer one of Dan's earlier questions on whether you're using funding to offset this enrollment issue, or, you know, what the conversations were, you know, back in the start of the pandemic around K-12 education funding? No? Okay. Well, thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your time. NAFO is putting together virtual programming throughout the fall and winter, so please visit our website, and we'll be adding those sessions as they're finalized. And we'll be sure to get this recording up on the website along with Dan and Austin's slides. And please feel free to reach out to any of us if there's anything you need or if you have questions. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you so much, Austin and Dan, for your great presentations.
Thanks, Erica.
Thanks.